In terms of medical care, in terms of using data for clinical purposes, how do you see the ownership issue of particularly clinical data?
Well, I think this is, from a policy perspective, it's fairly settled in the sense that the actual the data, the content, is really owned by the person. Now, the challenge, of course, is that the data resides in a digital expression in different people's asset bases, and oftentimes people confuse the storage of the data with the intrinsic intellectual knowledge that's sitting at the data level. But I think we've, as a matter of every country, we've basically set down basic policy rubric that's pretty clear. The data belongs to the person. I think the U.S. is probably going to have to catch up to Europe in the broader concept of data protection, broader than just the concept of data privacy. Concepts like the right to be forgotten are pretty important. Where I think this really plays itself out in healthcare is that, for the most part, the way we manage, let's call it consent, the right to use my information, has historically been at the document or the record level or physical paper level. But the fact that we are digitizing individual discrete data elements means that if we're really going to honor people's intent, we have to actually manage that consent at the data element level, not at the document level, or not at the visit level, but really at the level of every value, every code, and the idea that, because all those pieces just keep finding their way into other things, the file, the claim file, the EMR file gets used and reused and reused. And if I want to be forgotten, I have to be able to go find that element everywhere. And that's not a record. That is a specific data element. So there is a lot of advances going on right now around the technology necessary to create essentially a consent identity at every single element that's in a record, as opposed to at the record level. But that's only half the problem. The other half of the problem is managing that consent process. Because if the idea was that I was a researcher, or I was a app developer, and that I have a value proposition for you, and it might be advancing scientific research, or it might be building a product that makes your life better, I need to gain your consent. Well, how am I going to do that? If I send an email to you and ask you for your consent, that's never going to happen. And we all know that, right? And you won't even know how to answer that. And so increasingly, there's a whole discussion about who are these intermediaries. Some people call them consent brokers. These are trusted entities by the person whose data that's coming, that essentially engages in a relationship with you where you continuously specify the conditions under which you want your information to be made available for others. And then people who want that information essentially come to the consent intermediary to find out if they can get information and what kinds of information. And that's a three-party relationship. But I think, right now people are trying to figure out who that entity is. Outside the US, you're seeing mostly people thinking about government or quasi-governmental agencies because they're trusted. I think people, generally speaking, don't trust the tech companies to take that role in. At least the current level of trust doesn't really fit that. Our research on who you trust with your data clinically puts the tech companies at the farthest away end of the spectrum. The providers are at the closest end of the spectrum. But that's going to be another interesting area, is even if I can technically manage it, procedurally, how do I manage this? And so both of those are becoming evolving fields now. Both of them are necessary to gain the real benefits of this information.